Back when I should have been in this building writing my dissertation, I played a lot of World of Warcraft. At the time, the Burning Crusade was out, and I spent a lot of time in this zone, Terakar Forest. It's not a particularly beautiful zone. There's not a lot of reason to be there. It's a low-level Burning Crusade zone that you're supposed to briskly make your way through as you're leveling so you could go to the endgame material. But the reason I spent a lot of time in this zone was because of this piece of music. As an organist with a penchant for Messiaen, I loved that piece of music. There was nothing for me to do in Terakar Forest. I had out-leveled it. I didn't need any of the things that I could collect from it, but I would spend time in that. And it's not that I could go to Terakar Forest and just have that play. I'd have to wait for it to cycle through on the soundtrack. So I was choosing to spend my in-game time not being productive within the framework of the game, but simply there to listen to some music. And I realized that if I chose to move on and do the things that the game was asking of me, I couldn't listen to this music. So this is the kernel of my talk today, which is about barriers to listening to music in World of Warcraft. And it begins with the observation that the nature of the MMORPG is such that virtually no players will be able to experience all of the game content. As a result, there are barriers that prevent players from hearing all of the music that has been composed for the game. And in part, this is inspired by Dana Plank's talk back in 2015. So I began thinking about how these barriers operate, and I kind of lay them out along two axes. A synchronic versus diachronic axis, I'm borrowing these terms from Saussure, and a coarse versus fine. And I'm particularly fond of the diachronic versus synchronic because the example Saussure uses in his course of general linguistics is of a chessboard and the rules that govern the way the pieces can move around. So the basic framework looks something like this. Across the top, I've got a temporality framework where we have synchronic barriers and diachronic barriers, and vertically, a permeability axis where we have fine and coarse barriers. The temporality axis represents either synchronic barriers, and these are ones that exist within the structure of a game state, or diachronic barriers that emerge over time as patches and expansions are released for the game. Conversely, on the permeability axis, there are fine barriers, which represent coded limitations. This is content that the game either prevents or restricts or makes difficult for the player to experience. And on the other hand, there are coarse barriers. These represent incentivization structures that discourage players from exploring content. For example, it is a coarse barrier for me to listen to that piece of music because the game really wants me to move on and do something else. So we can look at these in turn. What is a fine synchronic barrier? This is anything coded into a particular game state that prevents players from accessing content, often due to a lack of ability or a lack of time. The best example of these in a game like World of Warcraft are represented by the endgame raid dungeons. In order to participate in a raid dungeon, first of all, you need a guild of people who are willing to run it with you. You need to have run all of the preceding raids, probably many, many times, so that everybody can get the gear that they need. And then you also have to farm materials for potions and things that you're going to use. It's a considerable commitment to get into an endgame raid. I've not ever been involved in an endgame raid. So for example, at the end of the current expansion, Legion, Argus the Unmaker is the final raid boss. And it requires a considerable amount of skill just to be able to hear the music that accompanies the fight. Conversely, a coarse synchronic barrier represents content available to a player, but content that he or she chooses to skip. In my case, that music represented the player versus player content, something I was never particularly interested in doing. Not being interested in arena gameplay, I'm not likely to ever hear the music that accompanies the arena Ashamane's Fall. Turning to the diachronic barriers, a fine diachronic barrier emerges when content is simply patched out of a game. A major event that happened in the lifespan of World of Warcraft was the Cataclysm, when, for example, Kalimdor flooded, and regions that you used to be able to access no longer were accessible. And music from the game was replaced with new versions of it. Danielle Wolf spoke of some of this last year on her talk on topical compatibility, looking at the Mulgore music that happened. So for example, here is the Thousand Needle Zone pre-Cataclysm, and then once the Cataclysm occurred, it flooded, and the base is no longer accessible due to the water. Anybody who played Horde side during the first several expansions knew this tune very well. This is the music that sounds when you enter the Horde capital of Orgrimmar. Those players, like myself, may have been disappointed in Cataclysm not to hear that music anymore, but that music was replaced by this. Many of the same topics appear. There's that very martial drum beat, the horns that are sounding, and so forth, but a different tune. So finally, a coarse diachronic barrier occurs when new endgame content is released, and there is then a reduced incentive to explore endgame content from previous expansions. So the way this works is, if you're in a current expansion cycle, you want to get to the highest tier. In Burning Crusade, that was level 70. There's a lot of content in level 70. When the next expansion is released, the game designers don't want you to have to do all of that content, but actually they allow you to move on to the new content several levels earlier. So when Wrath of the Lich King was released, you could move there at level 68. You didn't need to get all the way to level 70. And therefore, there was not really a good reason to go to Netherstorm and to hear the noisy ambient strains that accompany it. So this is the basic framework that I'm looking at, a diachronic, synchronic axis, and a fine coarse axis. But what I was interested in is ways in which these boundaries become flexible or less rigid, ways in which you could move through the boundaries in ways that are perhaps not intended by game design, or perhaps. So the first way is probably obvious. I already told you that I did not fight Argus the Unmaker, and yet I had the ability to get a screenshot of him and the audio that would play. How so? Of course, all of this information is available online, allowing one to peer over the wall. This is a screenshot from Wowhead, which is one of the principal databases that a WoW player is going to use for research. In fact, it's not just there, it's important to use this resource. Your raid group, if you want to do an endgame raid, will be very annoyed with you if you don't actually research the encounter and you cause them all to wipe. So you have to go use these resources. You have to peer over this wall just to even be permitted through for the first time. But I'm also interested in ways that barriers change over time. I already noted that the Orgrimmar music was patched out of the game. I also noted that this is music that people Horde side would listen to. Anybody Alliance people in here? Only played Alliance? Well, those with their hands up may never actually have heard the original Orgrimmar theme. For them, this was a synchronic course barrier. They chose to play Alliance. They did not choose to play Horde. Therefore, they chose to not hear this particular music. When the original Horde music was patched out, at that moment, when it was patched out, that coarse synchronic barrier became a fine diachronic barrier. Because at this point, they're no longer able to roll a Horde character and listen to this music. It's now closed off to them. Similarly, barriers that used to be fine and synchronic, such as Kel'Thuzad, who was the final boss for the original World of Warcraft release at the end of the Naxxramas zone. Very high-level stuff. This is as hard as Argus the Unmaker. If you're not a top-level player, you're not going to hear that music. But towards the end of the Burning Crusades run, when people have now attained level 70 and have considerably stronger gear, the possibility now exists to go back to Naxxramas in a bit of endgame tourism and experience the content that they couldn't previously. So this becomes a coarse diachronic barrier. If you want to visit Kel'Thuzad, you can, though there's not a particularly compelling in-game reason to do so. There's not going to be great rewards that are going to happen for having experienced this. Now, this was a problem at the time because this was one of the best encounters in the game, and so many players didn't have the opportunity to experience it. So when Wrath of the Lich King was released, this boss moved to early on in the rating tier, and thus it became another fine synchronic barrier. Slightly less difficult than it used to be. It was low early on in the progression. But again, it requires a certain degree of skill to get to this point. And then, again, 3 patches get released later. The level cap goes up up to 100 or so. And once again, Kel'Thuzad shifts back to the coarse diachronic barrier. And then, something that fans had been waiting for many, many years, the release of a World of Warcraft vanilla server, an official vanilla server. There had been unofficial servers for a very long time. Blizzard recently shut one of the most important ones down. And then in November, announced the release of World of Warcraft Classic. This would be the structure of the game as it was during the initial release. So this represents a diachronic reinstatement of barriers that were erected. So with this framework, I have several conclusions. One, this one's just an observation. Synchronic barriers are not uncommon in video games. We see these all the time. For example, the Dark Souls series. Raise your hand if you've played any of the Dark Souls games. Okay, keep your hands up if you gave up on the Dark Souls games. Yeah, my hand goes up too, right? Notoriously difficult games, that constitutes a fine synchronic barrier. Coarse synchronic barriers are there as well. The Breath of the Wild Lionel battles, the side quests, the Korok Seed collection, and as Wesley Bradford pointed out this morning, Link's memories, completing all of the shrines and the divine beasts. These are all things that the player may choose not to do. And I'm really intrigued by the last one. I've only had a couple of hours to think about it, but you do have the option to skip the divine beasts. But if you do, you don't get the 4 bonus abilities, and you have to defeat all forms of Ganon at the very end of the game. So that actually becomes a very new fine synchronic barrier if you take this option to run the coarse synchronic one. These Breath of the Wild examples, of course, are here just purely by accident. It had nothing to do with the fact that I was playing this game instead of working on this presentation. So the synchronic barriers are sort of common, but the diachronic barriers tend to be less common in video games and other media. Typically, an expansion is going to add content, not remove it. But a few do exist. A well-known example in Ocarina of Time is music from the Fire Temple. In the original release, the accompaniment featured some snippets of Islamic chant. When the issue of cultural sensitivity was raised, future releases of Ocarina of Time removed that track and replaced it with a synthesized one. And I gave some thought to diachronic barriers that exist outside video games entirely, and came up with several. There was the famous changing of the gun to walkie-talkie in the release of E.T. There was, of course, this monstrosity. It's very common in collectible card games for either future releases to either severely weaken cards that used to be powerful, or to have the designers forbid them from competition play, such as the Black Lotus in Magic the Gathering. A newish example of this comes in legacy games. When you tear up this objective card in Pandemic Legacy, you no longer have access to this objective. It is permanently out of the game. And as a child of the 70s and 80s, I don't even want to mention this monstrosity. That's not Mousetrap. So, finally, in conclusion, this time for real, synchronic barriers are a feature of the MMORPG lifespan. The fine synchronic barriers ensure that players do not run out of content too quickly. And the coarse synchronic barriers ensure that players have a wide variety of content to enjoy. Conversely, the diachronic barriers are a consequence of the MMORPG lifespan. The fine diachronic barriers emerge when designers wish to replace familiar content with new, and the coarse diachronic barriers emerge as a consequence of lowering other barriers, incentivizing players to move briskly to the new content and to ignore the old. Thank you.
Since the box was right next to me, I'm just going to go ahead. I have a question about high-level raids and who hears the music of those battles. Because something I'm sure you're aware of but didn't have time to mention here for people who don't play MMORPGs is that many of those fights in something like World of Warcraft or Destiny or what have you are dependent on complex communication systems, on the PC at least, that exist outside the framework of the game, something like Ventrilo or Discord, where players are encouraged to mute the music and lower their sound effects, prioritizing communication with other human players at the expense of the immersive experience the designers may have created or intended. So what percentage of players do you think actually does get to hear that music in the context of that fight?
That's a great question. And then it was quite difficult to find YouTube videos of these fights that had the music playing. Very often it was some kind of techno layered over it. 100% of the players get to listen to that music. In other words, the fine synchronic barrier is not there. They have access to that music. They could ignore their raid leader, for example, and listen to it. Many of them do, as you point out, choose not to listen to that music. And that then would move into the realm of the coarse synchronic barrier, right? That access is there, but the game and the social structure of the guild is going to be highly incentivizing them to turn that music down and not listen to it. So I wouldn't be able to give you a proportion of how many people do and how many people don't, but I think you raised a great point, but I think, again, I think that moves the issue from fine synchronic down to coarse synchronic.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for this. Thank you for this very, very amazing talk. So kind of following those lines, have you looked into whether or not there are people who choose to listen to the music, even at the expense possibly of what their guild members would actually like them to do?
That's a great question. Would require some ethnographic research, which I have not done, although I'm thinking about Will Cheng's work on the Lord of the Rings Online, where he does just that kind of research, and that would be a really interesting question to ask in that context. Yeah. Nobody wants to throw it anymore.
It is real soft. So anecdotally, yes, some people do leave the music on. But the plural of anecdote is not data. Anyhow, I was a vanilla player. I left by Burning Crusade. Some of my friends and I were sort of horrified when we heard that Cataclysm had done this, had gone and changed some zones and took the music out or changed the music or made parts of the zone inaccessible. Very much more often, the design of an MMO is just to add more, add more, add more, give you new things to try, but never take away the old things, so that if you do want to go be a tourist and spend your time in a place where maybe you're not necessarily supposed to be, like you did in Terracar Forest, you can. Particularly, those Alliance players could have visited Orgrimmar. It was just dangerous. Excuse me. What I'm wondering is, how related do you think Blizzard's decision to release these classic servers were to their realization that they had put up very strong barriers to the access of the old content? If they hadn't done that with Cataclysm, do you think they would be releasing WoW Classic now? And how much do you think, sorry, this may be another question rather than a related question, but how much do you think a player is losing by going on Wowhead or YouTube and seeing a video of the music as opposed to playing with the music?
As to the first question, not being Blizzard and not speaking to people at Blizzard, I can't answer that, of course. It's an interesting question. I know that they were resistant to it for many, many years, the idea of putting out the vanilla server. They said no, and for like a decade, they've been saying no.
Yeah, the Blizzard designer's quote was, "You think you want that, but you don't."
Yeah, exactly. Now, Cataclysm has been out for a long time, too, and there have been several expansions since Cataclysm has been released. So it's hard for me to imagine that that's a response to a moment that happened at the release of Cataclysm. I don't want to speculate further on why they may have done it. As for your second question, this is something that really affects me because I'm such a purist when I play a video game. I don't want to go looking at facts. I don't want to go online for answers, and I always feel a little bit dirty when I do. And yet, playing WoW and raiding with a guild, I just had to do it. Like there was no avoiding that piece of it. So it just had to be something that you participated in. I think it's virtually impossible to imagine playing high-end World of Warcraft or another kind of MMO without doing that level of research and without getting on Wowhead and looking at these materials. It just can't be done.
Hi. I was wondering if you could expand some on this concept of experiencing musical content as motivation for gameplay behavior and gameplay content. Two kind of anecdotal examples for me, both from Final Fantasy. One was finally beating Final Fantasy 3, not the 6-3, but the actual 3, and experiencing Cloud of Darkness's theme in Final Fantasy Dissidia and thinking, like, that's a cool theme. I want to go back and hear that, and then motivating me to go do Final Fantasy 3 DS and actually beat it. The other example would be the kind of cultural icon status that Final Fantasy 7 One Winged Angel takes on, and then so when some of us get around to finally playing it years after, like actually getting to the point where you can hear that theme in context becomes a motivating factor.
I think that part of the mission of a MMO and the reason you might design such a thing, especially the strategy that Blizzard uses, is to create a space in which players can do as much of what they want to do as they can. So you don't need to be an endgame raider to play World of Warcraft. You don't need to be a PvPer. You can be somebody that gets on for an hour after dinner, talks to your friends, does a little bit of cooking in town, and then logs off again. These are all options that are available, and I think it's part of the design that these options be available. So the motivation of listening to music as being an incentivizing factor, I don't imagine that's something that is hard-coded. I don't imagine that that's something that's on the minds of people as they're creating a game like this, but I also imagine that they're really pleased by it. When I was talking about running this by one of my friends that I used to play with all the time, and I showed him the Netherstorm slide, and he said, well, yeah, you can't go there to level, but there are some really great pets in Netherstorm. I could never have cared less about collecting pets in World of Warcraft. He loved collecting pets in World of Warcraft. And that, to me, there's no progression involved in pet collection. It's just something that you do with the game that brings you enjoyment. And from that standpoint, I would see no difference between musical tourism and pet collection to go to spaces that don't actually have any qualities of progression.
I got the cube.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you guys some insight from inside these companies. And don't take this as someone who's bitter and twisted, but once the game companies realized that every game could be sold back to GameStop and then sold to new people used, when the publishers realized that used games they made no money on, and once Always Online became a successful way of delivering content, that's when everything you're talking about started happening. And if I still own my first Nintendo Entertainment System, Zelda, from 1986. And nothing on it can change. It's impossible for that to change. But you should understand the huge financial reason that these things are happening. And you should also understand that I know the composers at Blizzard. I was just with Russell Brower a couple of weeks ago at New Jersey concert, and Neil Acree in Brazil, and Jason Hayes is a good friend. I mean, if you're a composer at Blizzard, you just have to crank. And there's very little adaptive music. They know exactly how this music is being used. And it's content that just fills a space, and it can be amazingly good. These are incredibly good composers and producers. But the reason that this exists is because they want you to continue to get their stuff, and you have no choice. You can't say, no, I like the original Destiny, for example, or I like the original World of Warcraft, and I just want to hold on to that and play it, because you have to go online, you have to take their patches, The fact that you can buy something and then have the people who sold it to you take it away from you after you bought it is anathema to me. And that's one of the things I'm really bitter about. I hate that. I think it screws the player, it screws the consumer. I think it's a bad thing. So I just think you should also understand that whatever you've studied, there's a very direct financial reason why publishers are doing what they're doing.
Yeah, that's a great observation, and I would love it. Do you have any insight to the question that was asked earlier about why would they go back and release vanilla WoW at this point?
Well, I don't know. Probably because so many people have this. Here's the thing. I remember early games. Like I like playing Halo 1. I made Halo 1, so I enjoy playing it. And you can't change it unless you play it on the Xbox 360 and they upgraded it, quote unquote. They actually changed things when they upgraded it. And then the Anniversary Collection Edition, it's not the same as the original. I mean, this is one of the weird things about video games. If you want to watch Casablanca, you can get a good copy of it, and it's the way it was. When Lucas had the Hans Shot First stuff, and he changed that, I mean, people went nuts. It's like, that is not what I saw in 1977. You shouldn't be allowed to change history that way. That's just sort of the instincts of fans. So I forget exactly what your question was, but I'm still sort of bitter about the fact that, oh, I know what it is. It's like, I think fans say, hey, I have a memory, and I bought something. I want to experience it exactly that way again. Please let me do that. And they finally gave in, although I wonder if anybody can really tell me that it's exactly the way they experienced it the first time, or if they've made subtle changes.
I don't even think it will be exactly the same as you experienced it the first time, even if
Well,
there
sure,
are no
because you
subtle
can play
changes.
it different ways.
Yeah.
I agree with that. But I mean, the content hasn't been altered, is what I mean. It's like,
It'll be
like
interesting
when
to
I
see.
heard the anniversary edition of Halo, I'm just like, oh, really? You thought that was important to change? I mean, you don't really need to change that, or the Master Chief Collection, whatever the heck it was. I mean, I'm just astounded by, the attitude that it's okay just to change stuff that people have a memory of. And then, when it's a game that's always online, all you have is the memory. You can't, even though you have it on the disc, you can't get it anymore. You cannot get Peter Dinklage to be your ghost anymore in Destiny. Now, whether you want that or not is another question, but you can't. They took that away from you, even though, 2% of the people say, I like Peter Dinklage. Mm-hmm. You can't get that anymore. They took that away from you. And it's, I don't know, I think fans should be more upset about that. Like, I bought that, whether I like it or not, I bought it. I should be able to choose whether I can experience it again.
Yeah, and that I'm sure goes to the heart of why the fans wanted Vanilla WoW so badly.
So this is being streamed. So this is online now, isn't it? Okay, great. Yeah. My name is Jason Hayes, for the record. Okay.
Well, thank you, Will Gibbons, for all of those comments that you were just giving me. They were really brilliant and insightful.